Good evening. I'm Susan Engel. I'm the director of 92Y Talks, and I have the privilege of introducing tonight's important and timely conversation with the public advocate for the city of New York, Jumaane Williams, and MSNBC correspondent and Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, Trymaine Lee. Both our guests work tirelessly to educate and inform the public, as well as serve the public and advocate for those who are less fortunate. Trymaine Lee is also the host of the podcast Into America. Jumaane Williams is committed to being an activist elected official, fighting for better policing and affordable housing and transparency in city government. Tonight's program is a fitting part of 92Y Confronts Hate, our initiative here at 92Y aimed to eradicate hate in all its forms. Dialogues such as the one you are about to hear are especially needed in the public square, with issues of racial and social justice ever so much on our minds. As a community center, we encourage your participation and invite you to write your questions in the comments section on this page. Without further ado, please welcome our distinguished guests.
Thank you so very much for this evening, especially in this moment. These are very important conversations. So thank you all at home who are watching, and thank you to the 92nd Street Y for having us. Jumaane, brother, good to see you.
You too. Peace and blessing, man. Honored to be here with you.
You know, I wanted to start off by asking you how you're feeling, but I think your shirt actually says it. It says, "I'm not okay." How are you feeling beyond that, or extrapolating from that in this moment?
We're all in some pretty tough times, and there's a lot of darkness. I don't think it's anything worse than many of our ancestors went through. So you try to keep that in perspective. But it's hurtful and it's painful nonetheless. But we each have work to do, those of us who are of elevated conscience, regardless of what you look like and how much melanin you have in your skin, because none of us are responsible for the system we got, but we're all responsible for the system we leave. And so I'm just trying to figure out what part I have to play in pushing a better system forward.
You know, obviously, as we're in the midst of this racial reckoning in America, there's a kind of a line drawn pre-George Floyd and post-George Floyd, but there are also other names, and I wouldn't want to name them all because unfortunately and sadly, there are too many. But I want to talk about Breonna Taylor in Louisville, Kentucky, a 26-year-old woman who was gunned down during a botched raid at her home, shot down by two police officers as she stood in her home. And just yesterday, the Attorney General, Daniel Cameron, announced that none of the officers would be charged in her death. And I want to ask you, coming off of yesterday's announcement, is this another example of justice denied Black people, or is there something in this case that offers something else? Because there are a lot of us out there who are saying like this is more of the same.
It may actually be worse. I think about, all the cases that have come before Supreme Court, and I think of the Dred Scott decision, and this is one of those that really are closely aligned with that, because it seemed that they went out of their way to reaffirm that property is much more valuable. It is property, that there's more accountability for property than there is for a Black woman's life. They went so far as not even mentioning Breonna Taylor's name in the press conference. And someone tweeted out the officer was actually indicted because he missed Breonna Taylor.
He'd been better off if he'd actually shot. The one officer, for those who don't know, there were 3 officers involved. One officer who actually was charged with wanton endangerment was charged for firing recklessly into the neighboring apartment, not at all for firing even at Breonna Taylor.
Yes. So if he had hit Breonna Taylor, maybe there'd be, he'd be all right. And further, as my brother, my son pointed out, he couldn't think of a time where a Black woman who was killed in this manner received any justice. We have at least 1 or 2 where we've seen some justice for Black men, very minimal. None for Black women at all, even a little bit, time and time again. On the same day, the President of the United States recommitted that he could not, he would not confirm that he'd submit to a peaceful transfer of power should election results come in that's one he disagreed with. And basically said if the only way we can have a fair election is if he wins. What's most troubling about that is not that he says that as president of the United States of America. It's the millions and millions of people who are cheering him on and the millions of people who want that system to continue that we saw yesterday. That's a painful place to be in. And so I usually start off many places I go with just letting people say that they're not okay. We have to be able to understand that that's an okay state to be in. And then I like Black folks to be able to say it, just to Black folks after everybody, because we're all going through collective trauma. I'm not okay. And I think I'll go a step further because I want Black women to be able to say they're not okay, because we all have to go back to work and pretend like everything's all right. And Black women in particular have no space in those places to exert any kind of emotion without fear of backlash.
How important is it in this moment to be able to have the space to say that? As you mentioned, Black women, the burden bearers of so many of our communities, the burden bearers certainly of the Democratic Party, too often they have to carry the weight for everyone else, but they have to be that strong Black woman, right? How important and critical is it in this moment where we are in the grips of defining who we are and who we say we are and who we want to be? How important is it to acknowledge that?
It is incredibly important to create space for people to say that they're not okay. Our mental stability is based on this. For far too long, we've had to pretend we were, we've had to continue we were. I was outside in the marches yesterday with some of the most important Black women in my life, my mother, my fiance, my stepdaughter, seeing the pain that they were going through. My mother, she shouldn't have been out there walking, to tell you the truth. People think about my stubbornness, I get it from my mom. She was out there with a similar mass saying she is not okay. This is a painful moment. And then when you're not even allowed that moment. And so we are at a space where you can see how much a system devalues you when you're not even able to reconfirm that your life matters. Simply the act of saying Black Lives Matter causes so much backlash. It's incredible. It's incredible. But it's a perfect example of the system just saying, no, it does not.
When you think about the last 6 or 7 months and you have COVID-19 killing Black folks, brown folks, and Native people disproportionately, especially Black folks, you have, the president from the White House down, there's a fire around every corner. You think about the killing of Black people across the country, the racial reckoning. Is there anything in this last 6 to 7 months that has given you any sense of hope? Anything that gives you some light in the darkness?
What always is my North Star is really the belief that the moral arc of the universe is long and it does bend toward justice. So I know we're in an arc. Sometimes it's steeper, sometimes it's not so steep, but that's where we are. I always think about ancestors who reaching out and saying, I dreamed of you. I dreamed of being in the space that you're in. So we have to dream of the future generations and not forget about them. And our job is to just bring this thing a little bit better than we found it. And as much as there is people, keep saying when we talk about bigotry, racism, discrimination, this is not America. It is. It is just as American as apple pie. It's in the DNA. But as American of that, which always gives me hope, there's always been the Americans who stood up and said, we're going to force this country to live up to what it says it is and not what it does in practice. And I am a proud part of that America. And there's a lot of that America still there. And people are listening to this, are probably part of that America as well. That gives me hope. And I think that's what this is about in life. Just trying to push forward and continue a fight that many of us didn't start, but it's our turn to continue it. So I do have hope in that. And, here in New York City, as bad as it got, sometimes we get a bad rap here in New York of rudeness and curtness. Some of that is earned, but also what's usually left out is the love energy that is in New York City. And that's very real too. And to see people filling the gaps that government didn't put in and people putting all they can to help their fellow New Yorker, that gives a lot of hope also.
You know, we saw George Floyd's death live and on camera, and we had to watch that officer with his knee on George Floyd's neck stare into the camera and put his hands in his pocket. And it frightened a lot of people. And they said, is this who we are? And as you mentioned, this is always who we've been. But this time, something seems a bit different. But do you fully buy it? We have the NBA, Black Lives Matter on the court. We have commercials. We have every corporation, including the one that I work for. Everyone is stepping up saying we want to do something different. But already the fires have faded and the tone has kind of dipped. Fortunately, we have this space to have this conversation. But do you believe this is a real inflection point, or do you think folks now have cover to say, yeah, sure, Black Lives Matter, and let's sell some Sprite? Black Lives Matter. Come watch the game. Don't be scared.
It is, it is interesting, and I have still not seen the George Floyd video. It's just too much, and I don't know if I can, get through that. The stills and pieces I've seen are more than enough. But it seems like before you can get past one picture or video, there's two more in the space. I do think there was a bunch of things that were combining. We were going through, and still are, it was a time period where we were in the worst of the pandemic, where people were literally seeing the discrepancies and inequity that folks have been ignoring for far too long. And people were home, and people were forced to go out as essential workers while others were able to stay home and do remote. They were sent out without any PPEs, without their communities being tested. And they saw people around them dying, losing their jobs. And then they had George Floyd, they had Breonna Taylor. And then they were punched in the face because they didn't have masks on that nobody gave them or told them they needed to really wear by officers who didn't have masks on. So all those things were very combined. And I think it was hard to ignore in a sense. And that George Floyd video just took it over. I do very much worry about collective amnesia that seems to happen after all of this. But I feel like right now we are at a moment where the country seems to be trying to atone with what it means to have enslaved an entire race of people for hundreds of years and what that can mean hundreds of years later. They're trying to, but it's a difficult thing to get past because it just means a lot, I think, to a system that doesn't want to atone for it. And having the president that we do, we're not able to have that conversation constructively. And we seem to be tinkering around the edges. So yes, there are things that we want to do, but are you going to put efforts into actually changing a system that doesn't work, or tinkering around with reforms that really don't do much? Are you going to say the right things, or is your boardroom going to actually change so that the people who are around there reflect the people that you're asking to buy that Sprite? I'm not sure if that's happening. And I will say, I applaud people in the NBA and I applaud LeBron and James. I really felt that we had a moment to really move this conversation. Economics moves folks. And I have to say, I was saddened. I respect both President Barack Obama and Michael Jordan, but their decision to get those folks to jump back in so early was an example of some of the concerns I've had with both of them on several issues.
This series is called, Confronting Hate. And I wonder if there's any way to disentangle hate from the systems that continue to bind us. Like, does it take ongoing hate to keep us bound in systems that, don't provide access to quality healthcare or education or safe living environments? Can you disentangle the two? Is hate actually the problem?
Hate, racism, bigotry, it's hard to disentangle it from that. It is otherwise irrational. There's not rational reasons for some of this, except for it helps keep a system going. And quite frankly, it is human nature to create silos. It is human nature to do an us versus them, especially when there are resources involved. And you want to make sure your family, your tribe, your village has the resources it needs. But when you're able to overlay race and say, I can easily identify where you belong in the caste system and where you should be, it makes it easier. So when you're able to put in way back when two people in the field and doing similar work, and you're able to say those same people, you know what? We're going to create whiteness so that we can say, at least you're not them. And you can hold on to that, and it gives your life meaning. It's very difficult to let that go, because without that, your life may not have the meaning that you thought it did. And so as much as I disagree and it angers me, I try to look at some kind of empathetic view of what that must feel like. I know what it's like to be Black in America, but to be white in America, and I imagine if you're told you're better than, you're told you deserve this exceptionalism, this entitlement, and then it doesn't come, and someone can just easily say to you, it's not coming to you because you had a Black president, or it's not coming to you because these folks over here. You can easily be manipulated, and all it does is keep the system going to make a few people really, really rich.
You have deep roots here in New York. You're an advocate for the community, and have been before you got the actual title public advocate. You've been advocating in our communities here in the city. And if you listen to a lot of people, they say, listen, New York is liberal, it's diverse, it's a big melting pot, it's all good. But there is something beneath that veneer, right, of this melting pot idea. And I wonder, how is this city, this very liberal bastion, right? How is New York City doing in terms of making it equitable for all?
Not good. And I always want to be clear, those issues are not just bad on Republicans. The issues of how bad we did at the beginning of this pandemic was not just a Republican Trump issue. It was local to our Democratic executives. We had the wrong president, the wrong governor, and the wrong mayor, and two of them were Democrats. If you look across the nation, you'll see Democratic mayors, Democratic governors who are presiding over cities and states that have remarkable inequities, remarkable issues with abuses of police power, just remarkable high rates of homelessness, unemployment. And those are Democrats that run those cities. And so incumbency protection becomes the thing that most electors are looking toward, whether they're Republican or the Democrat. And I have to add, oftentimes we want to talk about diversity. It is important, but it's not the only thing, because some of those cities and states are led by people who have melanin in their skin, such as Buffalo, such as Louisville, Kentucky. And the results are not always different than if there was someone who had less melanin in their skin. And we have to be clear and honest about that as well.
What are some of the keys to a more equitable city? So say we have all these issues in a place like New York City, which you'd imagine with all the brain power and that diversity and the income and all that we'd be in prime position to make sure that everyone has a fair shot, right? What are some of the keys? What could New York City be doing that can make things a little more fair?
We do have the keys and we do have the resources. What we don't have is the courage and the vision by our executive elite. And that's what we desperately need. And we need to be honest about where we are and honest about the inequity. So, very often people talk about economic inequities and economic inequality. And I try to talk about resource inequality, because I'm not sure that we'll always make the same money. I guess it would be great, but I'm not sure that's going to happen. I don't know if the amount of money you make should necessitate your ability to get health care or to have adequate housing. So we need to focus on resource inequality. That means we can't be scared of the people who make a lot of money and donate to politicians to prevent them from making decisions that benefit all of us. We know how to do it because the city came back roaring after several catastrophic things, except it didn't come back for everyone. And we don't seem to put the things in place that allow that to happen. So we have a governor who is trying to cut Medicare before the pandemic. And we have a governor who right now refuses to even say we're going to try to raise some revenue from the people who are wealthiest among us. He would prefer to cut services for the people who can't afford those services cut or have to pay more for those services. Those are real discussions we have to have. We have to have a discussion about why policing should not be equated with public safety and what public safety actually means. But that takes courage, and it takes leadership as vision and boldness. And we don't have a lot of that. And we see that amplified during this pandemic. This pandemic didn't create any new problems. It highlighted the ones that we've been fighting for a long time and people didn't address.
You don't have to look far to see the inequity, right? Not just in New York City, but across the country, across America, and all different kinds of places. But when you say that word courage, when it's so plain to see, why does it take courage to push for change when it's obvious what's the disparities?
It's a very difficult conversation. So when you have a mayor who at one time said, you know what, I had to have a conversation with my Black son about how to interact with the police, and then all the police turned their back on him. It takes courage to go through that. He capitulated and has done that more than one time. When you have people who are wealthy donating to your campaign like they do the governor, it takes courage to stand up to them and say, even though you're donating to my campaign, you must have some civic duty and come to the table at a time like this. And it takes political courage to say, I'm not going to make decisions that's best for my political career. I'm going to make decisions that's best for the people that I represent. Hopefully that gets me somewhere, and it may not. That courage is very lacking and is very wanting. We had 3 executives, I said, 3 cisgendered, straight white men, city, state, and federal, who failed miserable in the past few months, miserable. And the people who suffered the most are the ones that didn't look like them. And I do want to say everybody has suffered. And so I want to lift up all the experiences in everyone's socioeconomic sphere, because I know people who lost their lives and it's a painful thing. At the same time, we have to admit that there was a disproportionate impact that directly resulted from the lack of leadership and terrible decisions that were made by executives.
When we think about systemic inequality and structural inequality, sometimes we conflate terms. I know you've made a distinction between discrimination and racism. What's the difference there?
I believe that racism is a very specific thing, almost like anti-Semitism is a specific form of discrimination and bigotry. Racism, I think, really applies when we're dealing with race, primarily Black, white, and you also need a specific type of political power or privilege associated with racism. People want to use it interchangeably, but I don't really think you can. But someone can be prejudiced, someone can have discriminating thoughts and be a bigot. And so I always try to make that distinction so that we can separate what's going on. I think it's important to honor the experiences of people.
And how do those distinctions move us forward? Like, we're trying to find tools to kind of dismantle hate, dismantle the structural and institutional inequalities we see. How does that distinction help us?
Well, first of all, what I always try to say when I have these conversations, we have to allow people room to grow, and we have to put it in a place where someone can grab it. There's no sense in beating someone over the head when the minute you open your mouth, they're going to get defensive and we can't move forward. Or there's no space for people to make an error. There's no space for people to learn and grow. We don't want that either. And so when I talk about these conversations, the first thing you want to say is, when we discuss privilege and what it means, no one is saying that you're a bigot or a racist. You actually might be. You don't want to take that off the table ever. But that's not what's being said at this moment in time. You don't have to be a racist or a bigot to put forth a system based to help continue a system based on racism and bigotry. You don't. And once you can help people see that, then they might feel a little more at ease. Okay. So all we have to do is figure out what you can do within that system to make it a bit more equitable. And I think that's the space that we have to create for all of us. Because as I said, none of us are responsible for this. We were born into it. But all of us are responsible for what we leave. I think that's a place where we all can grab hold of something that we can do.
Obviously, when we're talking about racist, it's kind of a specific thing. And the opposite of racist isn't someone who is tolerant. It's an anti-racist. There are a lot of white allies who are not racist, but they're not necessarily anti-racist. What do white people who are in position to be allies of Black people and allies in dismantling the structures of inequality, what should they know about how all of these cogs kind of play together?
And that's really interesting, because some of even the most progressive white allies are all aboard until it hits home. And sometimes that sends the shift. We saw that in some places here in New York City. very much wanting to desegregate the schools until it was their child's school. Very much saying that we have to make sure that our homeless population is not on the streets until it was a homeless shelter next to them. So we need to make sure people are honest about the station they are in terms of privilege, and how much of that are you willing to actually change? Not by saying it, but in practice, because however much you're willing to change is probably as far as we'll go. And that's a hard question that I don't think people want to answer with themselves, staring in the mirror, because privilege probably feels pretty good to navigate a system with that privilege. And so it's hard to necessarily say we have to change that, but that's what we have to do, because the privilege comes at a humongous cost for other human beings. And we have to be willing to say that's a cost that's too much to bear.
I kind of have a two-part question here. We're in the midst of this reckoning, and of course, some of our white friends, our white neighbors, white colleagues, they're coming up to us as brothers and sisters saying, what can we do? And I want to ask you, is that even a fair question? We understand that they want to be on board, but asking Black people in America to help white people solve some of the issues that they set in place and benefit from can seem unfair. How do we respond in this moment to give people tools that they may not truly understand without also bearing the burden of educating a society who has devalued us and torn us down?
Well, one, I also forgot to point out when you asked the question earlier, I do think one of the differences is in the amount of white allies and Americans who, for actually the past year or so, been screaming Black Lives Matter. That's been a powerful thing to see.
Amazing.
And we have said for a very long time that this stuff is not going to change until white Americans come forth and really confront it. So we have to give credit where credit is due. We also have to make sure that there is a supportive role that's being played in some of these areas. That is anywhere that we're fighting inequity, whether it is racism, whether it is anti-Semitism, transphobia, homophobia, Islamophobia. We have to make sure that the most affected communities are the ones taking leadership and providing direction for where to go. So sometimes that doesn't happen. So that's the first thing. We're in a space, make sure the people who are most affected are the ones leading. And very often in the heat of the protest, I would tell my white allies and friends, if you're at a moment when it seems like it's getting chaotic and you're not sure what to do, unfortunately, this puts a burden again on Black women. But I always would say, in that moment, look for the Black women. They will guide you appropriately. And whatever they're doing, it is probably time to do that thing, because everything else has been exhausted. And the actions they take are intelligent, they're strategic, and they make sense. And so that's one thing I always say is, look for Black women and just follow the marching orders of them. The other is understanding that answering the question with some empathy. First, thank you for recognizing that there is something different there. The most annoying thing to me is people who say they don't see color. Like, why not? I don't understand what that means. And the question is, what do you do after you see it? Color is beautiful. Our culture is beautiful. Our differences are beautiful. It's amazing. It'd be a boring place if we didn't have different skin color, different hair, different songs to sing. So that just sounds silly often to me. But I do want to thank somebody who is recognizing that there's a system of privilege. And the question of what you can do is really, as you pointed out, probably in your community, in your own family, in your building, in your on your block. What is it that you can do, or what are you holding on to that is privilege that you may need to redesign, that is helping keep people down? What are we concentrating in one community that is harming that community simply because you don't want it in your community? Where you work, how you're responding. Black women discuss very often the fragility of white tears, especially white female tears, and the responses that come to that, that harm Black women. What part can you play in educating the people around you as we're trying to get through this, of what certain things may mean? Forcing the space that you're in to be truly more inclusive, not just putting a black face so we can say, here's our black person to work with this community. But who are the 5 or 6 people, if you are in a company and you have decision-making power, that you lean on and look for to make these decisions? Those are where the real changes need to occur. And so communities should help elevate themselves. Educate themselves on these issues. I can give some guiding points, but really the work is within and educating and figuring out what you're comfortable with. I always say, though, if you are comfortable in this moment, that you're not doing enough. And so our job is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable and really push the envelope.
Right now, again, to their credit, there are white people all across this country who are getting really uncomfortable having these tough conversations, but also actually out there in the streets. One thing that seems different in this moment than in times past is that this really has become a cross-racial, cross-cultural coalition. And I wonder, I'm sure you got this question before, but what makes this time different? We've seen Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, and dozens of names even before. What makes this time different?
As I mentioned, I think some of the difference is the fact that some of the stuff happened in a pandemic where it was extremely clear who was being hurt the most. At a time when we have a president who's all but said, white supremacy, neo-Nazism is a cool thing. Like, it's okay. And it's very, very clear about that. It's really hard to ignore that. And of course, the advent of social media have shown people things the same way TV did in the 60s when people couldn't ignore what was happening. And it seems like one case is worse than the other. And it's not just a case of bad apples, it's a case of a system that needs to be changed. And understanding that this system was created many, many years ago. It's like starting hopefully to realize that if the quote unquote founding fathers woke up, they would probably say, I don't know why you had a black president. I'm not sure why women are voting, but otherwise pretty good job of pushing forth the system we put in place. And that simple reforms and tinkering won't help this. Now, I always say if you have a house and you have a small crack in the wall, you might be able to plaster it up. But if the foundation of the system of the house is problematic, that's a lot more costly. It's a lot harder to do. And I think there were people waking up based on the crises that were overlaid, that our foundation is problematic. And we have a president right now supported by Republican leaders who are saying, you know what, our foundation is just fine.
What role do you think Black folks in particular, but Black and brown people have in kind of remedying what's been wrong? Because I talk to a lot of brothers and sisters say, you know what, we're just about fed up, right? There are a few more lines to cross, and folks will find themselves in a position that they would rather not be in terms of what the solutions might be. So what role with that frustration that folks are feeling, the feeling that no matter what they do, and no matter how hard we push, the same system gets back in lock? What can we do? What role do we play?
I first do want to say I feel that frustration. I just want to make sure I'm telling people 2 things really quickly. One, fill out your census. That is extremely important. Y'all president have given you till September 30th. It is very, very important. Most people saw what happened in hospitals like Elmhurst and Queens that were overrun immediately, not understanding that the hospital beds that were given to Elmhurst were decided on the census that was filled out 10 years ago, except only about maybe about 60% of the people fill out the survey, so they only had 60% of the beds. We're way under that in places like New York City and other urban areas. So you got to fill out your census, and you do have to vote. It's not the end all, it's not the be all and end all, but it is a tool. Why waste a tool? I am fed up with Democrats as well, but we are in an existential crisis. And this is one time where the best thing we can do to get Trump out of office is vote. So get him out, and then we hold other people accountable on January 20th, but we got to get out and vote. What I have just come to accept and realize, being Black in America, you just have to work 2-3 times harder. That's what has to happen. And then, as I said at the beginning, our job is, living the best life you can, I think, but it's also not forgetting there's a generation coming after us that we cannot forget about, because the generations before us did not forget about us. And they dreamed of something that they didn't have. And they gave their all to fight. and they resisted and fought in many ways, some known, some unknown. And our job is to do that. And so I want to keep making folks uncomfortable until this stuff change. And so what I would say is, keep the streets hot in any way that you can. I'm a believer in king and nonviolence. And so I always push that. That doesn't mean peaceful. And so Dr. King was a disruptor. And there are things that have to be disrupted. You can't make this kind of change without disruption. So we have to keep doing that. And that's just a thing, unfortunately. But as you said, it's now multiracial, multicultural, and that's powerful to see. My thing is, we can be tired, and we can sit down for a second, but we do have to keep going. I know that people of African descent have found a way to push forward, struggle, fight, and still enjoy life. That is some gifts that the Most High gave us, and that has come through us, through ancestors. So we should use that ability to smile, to laugh, to dance, and fight through the struggle and continue. I think that's a responsibility we have, and some of our price of being blessed with life by the Most High.
Has there been anything, when you look at this convergence of the racial reckoning, police brutality, and COVID-19, has there been anything that's been revealed about who we are as Americans that has surprised you, good or bad? Any kind of revelation that you said, wow, I didn't see this coming?
I'll go back a little bit, and this is about gun violence. This is before pandemic. One thing that struck me, I always believed if certain things happened to white Americans, we might have a change. And when Sandy Hook happened, and I saw those little children killed, massacred, my God.
Yeah.
And then it happened to be predominantly white children. I said, okay, something's going to happen now. Something's definitely going to happen now. And nothing did. That was probably the biggest shock of my life when I realized this country just has a demonic obsession with guns in a way that I couldn't fully fathom before that, and realize how difficult it actually is going to be. During the pandemic, with this president, every time I think something more atrocious can come out of his mouth, it does. So I just have to stop saying that. Like yesterday, reconfirming this, not having a peaceful transition, and people, the way they're celebrating it. It's like people look back at Germany and other places and say, well, how could this type of hatred rise up into power? And literally right now, we're showing people. And it's always shocking to me that people won't look at a video, won't look at a book. The playbook of hate and bigotry and how it plays out the exact same way every single time, whether it's messaging, silencing the media, creating an other for people to hate. Like, all this stuff gets played out, trying to consolidate power. It's playing out exactly as the playbook says. And it just continues to shock me that the blind bigotry in some people's minds just that part has been remarkable to me. With the pandemic, some of the decisions have surprised me. We literally, here in New York City, and I'm sure other cities, split the city in two. We said, one of you can stay at home, you will get tested, or you can go to the Hamptons. And the rest of you have to go to work. You are now essential. You don't have a choice. We're not going to give you any PPEs because we don't think we have enough. We're not going to test your communities, even though that's where most of the deaths and most of the high virus rates are going. We are only going to discover public housing maybe 6 weeks into the coronavirus outbreak. We're going to put the field hospital in the white wealthier neighborhoods and the floating hospital in the white wealthier neighborhoods. The New York Post, and everybody knows the New York Post, they're not a bastion of liberalism and progressivism. They put an article that said 25, out of the top 30 zip codes that were tested, 25 were in white wealthier neighborhoods. Those were decisions that were made by the governor in particular, and the mayor to some regard. And it's just surprising to me that like the governor is still celebrated for making some great decisions when he made terrible ones, particularly at the beginning of this pandemic, where we didn't act bold enough, we didn't act quick enough, we didn't adapt to new information as we got it, and there was a human cost to that.
Brother, you mentioned the arc right, of the moral universe and justice. And I want to ask, do you really, really believe that America can be better than what it is right now? Because at time and again, we've been reminded of that our racism and bigotry, it's not a detail of what America is, it's an actual feature of who we are, right? Do you believe that we can change, that we can be better, that we can even the playing field and not hate?
Yeah, I think it's hard. It's designed this way, so it's hard. But as much as people don't want me to say it for different reasons, this is the country I was born in, and this is the country that I love. This is the country that I know, and I'm going to fight to make it better. And I believe that we can. It's just extremely difficult, and it's disheartening. But I think our job is just to run the race and then pass off the baton. You look at John Lewis, you look at Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She fought as hard as she could. I think everybody knows she literally was trying to hold on. She knew what was at stake. This woman has been sick for a while. She was tired. She kept fighting, man. She just kept going. I'm going to hold on. I'm going to hold on. I'm going to hold on. And she just couldn't. And we got to take some of that energy and some of that. And again, our job is not to create a perfect world right now. I think that at the end of that arc, there is a much better, equitable world. That doesn't happen overnight. Our job is to do what we can with what we have, where we are, and to bring it a little bit further. And I honestly believe we all can do that part. So if we don't think about the perfection and the end of the arc, we got to slide it a little further. I believe we can do that. But we also have to remember that the system is going to want to auto correct. So when Reconstruction happened, the system was like, well, hold on. You're not supposed to have these black folks in the Senate and all these, right? So it started auto-correcting with Ku Klux Klan and Jim Crow. And we see the same thing happening with a black president. That wasn't supposed to happen. So it begins to auto-correct. We have to prepare for that a little bit better. I think we elected Barack Obama and thought our job was done. And it just wasn't. So we have to take a little bit of responsibility there also. And not just let our foot off the gas when we do get something that is helpful.
Jumaane, thank you very much, man. I want to give an opportunity for our audience members who are watching to ask a few questions. I'm going to turn now to the audience. And so we have the first question is, what is the biggest challenge facing NYC right now?
Oh, man.
Where do you begin?
Yeah, there's just a lot. I mean, I think, as I mentioned, we have the wrong leadership from top to bottom. And, I look at the governor, who I think is a great bureaucrat. And I say that in complimentary. Bureaucracy by itself is not a bad thing. And so he's able to tell you and work it so that the train can run on time. But what we lack is a bold visionary who can create a new train system. And so that's been very difficult in the time when we need it. We have a mayor who I don't think is good at either. So we really have to get some new leadership and really have to focus on these elections coming up, because there is human cost to those inactions. And I think the discussion on public safety is extremely important. We put out a 10-point plan, really trying to make a distinction between policing and public safety. That policing is a part of public safety, but it's not the only thing. That is a very difficult discussion to have, and you have to have someone who has the courage and the mettle to push through it. When you have unions who are endorsing Donald Trump, unions whose leaders would probably make very good police chiefs in the Jim Crow South. It's a difficult conversation to have, but we have to push through it. One of the things that you asked earlier about what has been hopeful is that very often when crime spikes, as has happened, people are so fearful they will release their asks to have better policing. And our communities aren't doing that. They are demanding better policing and safer streets at the exact same time. And that gives me hope, because those communities are sandwiched between street violence and over policing, which is rooted in the same thing. And sometimes when you try to demand accountability on the over policing, their response is under policing. And people get so nervous they stop fighting for the things, but they're not. And that gives me hope as well.
That's a great point. Another question we have is, where could there be common ground with Republicans and Democrats, or is that not possible?
I always believe everything is possible, and I try to find common ground. One of the things I'm most proud of is being an activist elected official. It's important to me that you can get things done. And I believe we passed maybe our 62nd piece of legislation at the moment. At the time when I was leaving, the council had more pieces of legislation than any other council member besides the speaker. At this moment in my public advocate career, we've passed more pieces of legislation than any other public advocate in their entirety. So very, very proud of it. And that can only happen by finding common ground. It is possible. What I don't think we should do is let go of truth. And that's something that, I believe facts are going to make a comeback at some point, and we have to hold on to it. And the truth of the matter is, some of our disagreements, there is no moral equivalence in them. There is no moral equivalence in the beliefs of white supremacy and neo-Nazism. It just isn't. There's no moral equivalence in saying that we want to change a system that has been over-policing us to saying all you need is police. Just send more police to this problem. So I want to be able to be, we're going to need some truth and reconciliation once this man is out of the White House of really what happened and what people supported. And they didn't support it in spite of the thing. They supported it because of it, because this president hasn't been beneficial on anything, from economics to the handling of the pandemic. So much so that they love the bigotry, that they're willing to just bend and deny the truths of science, of weather. It's just remarkable to see.
So I also believe in practical responses, right? And news you can use. And I think this is an opportunity with this question. And it's kind of broad in general, but how can I use my voice in an institution that tries to silence it?
Oh, it's a good question. I actually would need some more context. But what I also try to let people know is very often we are focused on the end of a thing, and the end of a thing can be so big, it's daunting. And so we should always just break it down into some small bites and steps that we can actually take. And so you may not be able to change the entire world, but you could probably change your world. And sometimes it's important to, if you're in the city of New York trying to change the city, you might be able to start with your block. You might be able to start with, your social media setting, the 5 or 10 people in your circle. And so I would start there and then try to build upon that. Because sometimes when you try to jump to change the entire institution, it's daunting and it probably won't happen. But wherever you are in the institution, trying to change that little sphere or connect with somebody else. We also have to remember we are not responsible for the entirety of everything. We have a minute we can spare. If we can get 59 other people, that's 60 minutes, that's an hour. And if we have a penny to put in, we get 99 other people, that's 100 pennies, that's $1. And so we have to do what we can where we are. And I think if actually everybody did that, we'd be in a lot better space.
So adding to that, it was in terms of schools or the workplace, which I still think you answered that question. So here's another one I think is another useful one. What influence can the public advocate have on the political system at large? So they're basically asking, like, man, what do you do? Right?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. I think a lot of people in New York City don't know, so it's not a bad question. I think there's only 2 public advocates. One, I believe, is in Maine. It's a state one, and here is in the city. So here in the city, charter, you have 5 basic powers. As legislative, you can introduce legislation. You're an ombudsman. Basically, you go between the people in the city. A charter cop, making sure the agencies are doing the job the charter empowered them to do. You have a vote on the pension board, and you can appoint people to committees like the City Planning Commission, like CCRB, which is the Civilian Complaint Review Board, civilian oversight over the police department. I think the bully pulpit is a very big power that is overlooked. So we've been able to use our voice to push a lot of issues. Most recently, we pushed a plan on resilience and recovery, systemic inequity, reopening of schools that the mayor is now trying to follow a little bit late. We're taking risks and spending money we don't have. We put forth a 10-point plan on public safety that we're going to be expounding on. So we're using our platform, I believe, to the best of our ability right now. But we have a lot more work to do.
Okay, if you were president, what would you do to heal the racial divide? Another big one. If you got it, you might as well run, man. You might as well do it now.
First of all, president is a hard job. I never want to dismiss the difficulties of it. The people should not dismiss the difficulties of it. But one, you should probably have some semblance of intelligence. And I think people confuse being rich with being intelligent. It's two different things, right? And if you're not intelligent, or even if you are, you get people who are smarter around you to do a lot of different things, and you trust those folks, and you trust in science. But also, you have to acknowledge that there is something, right? You have to acknowledge that there's not, quote unquote, good people on both sides. That there's no more equivalence there, like, right? You can't both sides to some of these issues. You have to acknowledge that, and you have to set up a nation to have an honest conversation with itself. Like, you need to lay out where we are, the difficulties moving through it, and here's the plan of how we're going to move through it, so that we can go through this together. One of the worst things is to not have a vision. That people fail and the people falter when there's no vision. And right now, the only vision that this president has is how to win an election, and it's endangering a lot of people. So I would set forth a realistic expectation of a conversation that we have to have and guide people through. Here in New York City, we should be doing the same thing. We have some tough years ahead of us. Here's how we're going to do it. Here's a list of bad decisions that we have to make and the bad options we have. And here's how I'm choosing the best of the bad options. Very often, our leaders are choosing the worst of the bad options and are making things very difficult. But we can't run away from these conversations. And we have to explain better how the plight of a white farmer in Arkansas or somewhere is connected to a Black trans woman who's dying with impunity in this country. We have to do a better job of saying how both of those things are connected in a nation where none of those things have to happen.
I'm going to ask a follow-up to their question. And I wonder if you think, or how much you think President Donald Trump has kind of set us back in terms of racial relations. Like, he says the Blacks love him. He says Black people have never been better. You have nothing to lose. And we should just be happy that we're in this moment. But how far do you think he actually set us back in terms of like that big arc, that big picture?
I like to say is he probably hasn't set us back as far as he'd like to. I think he wants to go way back. When you say make America great again, what people have to remember is they're talking about, I think, specific Americans. And the reason, again, that specific Americans were able to benefit was that the burden and the pain of other Americans. And nobody either. What we tend to do, what we try to pretend is that our prosperity and the ability and Southern charm and the Southern way of life, it was simply some people were better than others, and so they were able to do that. No, they did that because of the subjugation of folks and making life hard. Somebody paid a cost for that. And this country has always been about subjugation of people. Even now, we would never deport, by the way, all of the undocumented immigrants, because our economy would collapse, would simply collapse. But we like to have a group of folks that we can look at and say, you're not going to get, your humanity viewed the same, but we want to use your labor because it makes our lives better. So he has set it back a long way. And the hard part is seeing people just go along with it. And there are many of us who are saying the conservative way of thinking was this all along. And you can try to do it in little ways, but now everybody's like, F it, excuse me. We're just gonna be who we are and who we've always been. I think that's gonna be hard because once he's out of office, whenever it is, we're gonna have to look at our neighbors knowing what they supported, knowing what flags they waved.
Do you think his presidency has changed the bar and expectation for who could come next in a way that's irrevocable?
We've always seen that to be Black and get a chance, you got to be the best. Like Obama, Cat Williams, I can't say the way he did it, but he's like, this man, he don't owe nobody $5, nothing. You got no scandal, nothing. You have to give the best of. But for other folks, you can give the bottom of the barrel. And Donald Trump is the juice that comes out of the garbage, and he was able to be president. I hope that we just do a reset, and man, it is hard. One thing I do want to ask folks, I saw a Netflix series called The Social Dilemma, and I would recommend. I don't want to plug anything, but it was very eye-opening because very often people are in their own silos and wondering how could the other group be so stupid. And what that showed you is that we are very clearly and intentionally putting people in silos, and the echo chambers are only getting louder and louder and louder and louder. And so when you have social media that only has your people who think like you, and you're using news sources that only think like you, and you're not checking your news sources against other reliable sources, it's very difficult to have a conversation. One of the things that was most striking to me, which I didn't know, that Google searches change what automatically comes up depending where you are. So if you're in New York and you type in climate change, it will tell you about why climate change is bad. But if you're in a quote unquote red state, the first thing that might come up is climate change is a hoax. And what that does to the echo chamber is magnify in ways that really explain how we got, or in part how we got to this situation. And it's a pretty revealing. And I think, again, I always try to empathize, even if as angry as I get, because empathy helps you figure out how to solve the problem. So I never want to lose that. But I recommend people look at that, because I think it was very eye-opening on how this system sets up and really forces us to make decisions we don't even consciously know we're doing.
With just a few minutes left, I want to just ask this last question. Again, this is another big one, but I think you might have an answer for it. How can we fix our broken government?
We often say we're in a democracy, but most of the decisions that are made are based on incumbency protection. It's just a fact. We definitely have to elect people who incumbency protection is not the main thing. And so I try to live my experience as an elected official with knowing that the people that I represent are more important than the seat that I'm holding. And the decisions I make, first of all, I do want to get reelected. I may go somewhere higher, who knows? Like, I want those things, but I make my decisions not based on those, or at least I try to minimize. I'm human, so I can't act like there's no kind of politics, but I try to minimize it and make my decisions based on what's best for the people. And we have to empower people like that. And we have to remember that just putting people who look like us in these places are not the fix, because very often what I've seen is, even when, just in case of black folks got elected, their main thing was to replace the people who were there, but keep the system. And that didn't help anyone. It just replaced the very few who were there, that the system now can help them and their friends, but the rest of us were left out of the lurch. So anything that helps lift up people who think about this stuff differently and who are about changing systems, not keeping it just for their friends, and anything that helps people empower their vote. This is what we need. So I support things like ranked choice voting. I support things like early voting, making it easier. The secret is most electors really don't want more people voting. They like to know who's voting and how they can manipulate that small group. We need to open that pool up, make it easier for people to vote, and empower that vote.
Jumaane Williams, thank you so much for your time. This was an important conversation, especially in this moment. To the 92nd Street Y, thank you as well. Jumaane mentioned the word courage, and I think it's courageous to make sure folks have a platform to have these kinds of conversations. And for everyone watching, you could have been a lot of places, but you're here with us. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, I'm sorry, one more thing I have to remember. You got to vote in more than the presidential elections. Your local elections are critically important. They oftentimes make more decisions than the presidential. So that's one place we can fix government, is locally. So I just had to mention that. Thank you, though. Peace and blessings to everyone.
Peace.